My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I'm about to tell you. 23 years of lies that everyone believed, including me, until I got too close to the truth and nearly died for it. You think you know about Mike Harrington. Hell, everyone in the system thinks they know about Mike Harrington. The guards whispered his name like he was some kind of prison god. The shot callers from every race bowed their heads when his orders came down the pipe. For 2 decades, that man's reputation cast a shadow over every yard from Pelican Bay to Chino, and we all bought into it. I was a Peckerwood leader for 15 years, started as a fish in '98 at San Quentin, worked my way up through blood, sweat, and more bodies than I care to count. By 2010, I was calling shots for 3 different yards, moving weight that would make your head spin, and I thought I understood how the game worked. I thought Mike Harrington was the king of kings, the man who built the empire that kept us. All in line. I was wrong, dead fucking wrong. See, the thing about prison is that everyone's looking up at the hierarchy, trying to figure out who's really in charge. The COs think it's the wardens. The fish think it's the shot callers. The shot callers think it's the big names like Harrington. But nobody, and I mean nobody, was looking at the shadows behind those big names. Nobody was asking who was feeding Harrington his information, who was bankrolling his operations, who was making sure his orders reached every corner of the system without him ever having to lift a finger. I started asking those questions in 2013, right after I watched Harrington order a hit on a Norteño leader in Corcoran. The green light came down clean. No static, no pushback, just smooth as silk execution. But something didn't sit right with me. I'd been in the game long enough to know that kind of coordination doesn't just happen. You don't move pieces across 5 different facilities, through 3 different gangs without serious infrastructure, without serious money, without serious connections that run deeper than any one man. That's when I started paying attention to the quiet ones, the guys who never made headlines, but somehow always knew what was coming before the rest of us. The lifers who'd been down since the '80s, but still had reach on the streets. The trustees who moved through restricted areas like they owned the place. The names you never heard in the yard, but whose whispers carried more weight than Harrington's loudest threats. It took me 3 years to piece together what I'm about to tell you. 3 years of following money trails, mapping communication networks, and watching patterns that most cons never even notice. 3 years that ended with me in protective custody, a green light on my own head, and the knowledge that everything we thought we knew about California prison power was a carefully constructed lie. Mike Harrington wasn't the architect of the West Coast prison empire. He was the frontman, the distraction, the face they put on camera while the real power brokers operated in complete darkness. And when I figured out who they really were, when I got too close to exposing the network that had been running the show since before most of us were even born, they tried to bury me alive. But I survived. And now, after a decade of keeping my mouth shut, watching from the shadows while the same lies continue to spread, I'm ready to tell the truth. Because the empire didn't crumble when Harrington fell. It didn't even slow down. That's when I knew for sure we'd all been played from day one. The real power in California's prison system isn't where you think it is. It never was. And the people pulling the strings, they're still out there, still operating, still laughing at how easy it was to fool everyone, guards, inmates, administrators, even the FBI, into believing that one man could control it all. This is the story of how I learned the truth, how I discovered the shadow network that's been running the show for decades, how I found out that Mike Harrington was just another prisoner, just another pawn in a game so much bigger and more dangerous than any of us ever imagined. This is the story they don't want you to hear. The first crack in the Harrington myth came from the most unlikely place, commissary records. Sounds stupid, right? But in prison, money is power, and power leaves traces if you know where to look. I'd been running books for my crew since 2009, keeping track of who owed what to whom, making sure the numbers added up when we moved product or collected debts. Part of my job was watching the flow of cash through the system, not just the under-the-table stuff, but the legitimate money too. Commissary accounts, money orders, legal fees. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about someone's real situation by following their paper trail. Harrington's trail didn't make sense. Here was a guy, supposedly running operations across a dozen facilities, coordinating movements that required serious capital, maintaining relationships with shot callers from every major gang in California. But his commissary account? Always flush, but never too flush. His money orders? Regular as clockwork, but always from different sources. His legal fees, covered by some high-end firm that specialized in appeals for lifers, but the payments came from a trust fund that nobody could trace back to any family. Or criminal enterprise. It was too clean, too organized, too managed. Real kingpins in the system, they've got messy money, irregular deposits from multiple sources, sudden windfalls followed by dry spells, family members scrambling to keep their accounts funded. Their financial patterns look like what they are. Criminal enterprises held together by violence and fear, constantly adapting to law enforcement pressure and street-level chaos. Harrington's money looked like it came from a corporation. I started comparing his patterns to other high-profile inmates, and that's when things got really weird. The guys everyone said were under Harrington's protection, their money patterns were chaotic, unpredictable, exactly what you'd expect. But there were others, names I'd never heard mentioned in connection with any major operations, whose accounts showed the same suspicious regularity as Harrington's. These were mostly older cons, guys who'd been down since the 80s and early 90s. Long-termers who kept low profiles, rarely got into beef, and somehow always had what they needed without anyone asking how. I started calling them the quiet ones, and the more I dug into their finances, the more convinced I became that they were part of something bigger. The breakthrough came in 2014, when I got my hands on some intake records from the 80s. I was looking for something completely different, trying to track down family connections for a debt collection, when I stumbled across admission paperwork for 3 of the quiet ones. All 3 had been processed within 6 months of each other in 1987. All 3 had similar charges, drug trafficking with racketeering enhancements. All 3 had been represented by the same law firm, the same firm that was still handling Harrington's appeals 30 years later. But here's the kicker. All 3 had originally been sentenced to different facilities. Somehow, through a series of transfers that made no sense from a security standpoint, they'd all ended up in the same prison within 2 years. And once they were together, they never left. Even when overcrowding forced other long-termers to bounce between facilities, these 3 stayed put. That's when I realized I wasn't looking at random inmates who happened to have similar financial patterns. I was looking at a network that had been operating continuously for over 2 decades, with resources and connections that predated Harrington's rise to power by nearly a decade. I started tracking their communications, prison phone logs, visitor records, mail receipts. What I found blew my mind. These guys weren't talking to family or old criminal associates like most lifers. They were in regular contact with lawyers, accountants, and business managers. They were receiving legal documents that had nothing to do with their own cases. They were making calls to numbers that, when I checked, belonged to corporations and investment firms. They weren't just serving time. They were running businesses from inside the walls. And Mike Harrington? When I finally managed to track down his communication records, I found something that changed everything. Most of his calls weren't going out to the streets, to gang members or family. They were going in, to other inmates, specifically to the quiet ones. Harrington wasn't giving orders, he was receiving them. The whole power structure everyone believed in was upside down. The shot callers thought they were taking orders from the king, but the king was taking orders from people nobody even knew existed. And those people weren't just managing prison operations. They were managing outside operations too, using the prison system as a cover for legitimate businesses that had been laundering money and moving product for decades. I'd stumbled onto something bigger than gang politics or drug trafficking. I'd found a shadow corporation that used California's prison system as its corporate headquarters, with Harrington as its most visible middle manager and the quiet ones as its true board of directors. That's when the threat started. The first warning came through a kite slipped under my cell door at 3 a.m. No signature, no gang markings, just 8 words in block letters. Curiosity killed more than cats stop digging. I should have listened, but by then I'd already seen too much. The financial patterns, the communication networks, the business connections, it all pointed to something that went way beyond what any of us thought we understood about prison power. I wasn't just looking at a drug operation or a protection racket. I was looking at a legitimate criminal enterprise that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The quiet ones weren't just coordinating gang activities, They were running investment portfolios, I know how that sounds, but stick with me, because this is where everything gets really fucked up. Remember, I'd been tracking their communications, and what I found in those phone records wasn't gang business. It was conference calls with commodity traders, stock purchases, real estate acquisitions, insurance claims. These guys were running a diversified criminal portfolio that made traditional organized crime look like kids selling lemonade. Here's how it worked. The quiet ones had connections on the outside, lawyers, accountants, business managers, who'd been washing their money through legitimate investments since the late 80s. While everyone was watching the flashy gang leaders and the drug trafficking, these guys were quietly building a financial empire that generated clean income year after year. The prison drug trade? That wasn't their main business. That was just one revenue stream among many, and not even the most profitable one. They were moving money through construction companies, restaurant chains, import-export businesses, even tech startups. The drug money was just seed capital for much bigger plays. And Mike Harrington was their perfect frontman. High-profile enough to draw attention away from the real operators, connected enough to the traditional gang structure to maintain credibility, but ultimately dependent on them for the resources that made his reputation possible. I started mapping out the whole network, and what I found scared the shit out of me. This wasn't just about California prisons. The quiet ones had connections to similar operations in Texas, Arizona, Nevada, even federal facilities. They were part of a nationwide network of long-term inmates who'd figured out how to turn prison sentences into business opportunities. The communication system was incredibly sophisticated. They weren't relying on prison phones or smuggled cell phones like the regular gangs. They had legal channels, attorney visits, paralegal consultations, expert witness interviews that gave them completely protected communication with the outside world. And because they were conducting legitimate business, their communications were privileged. Law enforcement couldn't touch them. They'd turned the Constitution into a criminal protection racket. But the most disturbing thing I discovered was how deep their influence went into the prison system itself. Remember how I said the quiet ones never got transferred, never faced serious disciplinary action, always seemed to have what they needed? That wasn't luck or good behavior. That was payroll. I found evidence of regular payments going to guards, administrators, even parole board members. Not bribes exactly, because everything was structured through legitimate channels, consulting fees, legal retainers, investment opportunities. But the pattern was clear. Anyone in a position to affect the quiet ones' situation was somehow getting paid by their outside network. They'd corrupted the system so thoroughly that it was actually working for them instead of against them. Prison wasn't punishment for these guys. It was their corporate headquarters, complete with a captive workforce, protection from outside law enforcement, and privileged communications with their business partners. And Mike Harrington, he was their spokesman, their face to the traditional criminal world. When gang leaders needed to coordinate operations across racial lines, when drug suppliers needed guarantees for their shipments, when territorial disputes threatened to disrupt business, they went to Harrington. But Harrington wasn't making decisions. He was relaying messages from the quiet ones, who were making decisions based on business considerations that had nothing to do with gang politics or criminal honor. The whole California prison power structure was a shell game, and we'd all been watching the wrong shells. That's when I made my biggest mistake. I started trying to document everything I'd learned. Phone records, financial patterns, business connections. I was building a case file that would expose the whole network. I thought maybe I could leverage it somehow, use it to protect myself or negotiate a better position. I should have known better. You don't investigate a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise without someone noticing. The second warning came from my own crew. My lieutenant pulled me aside during yard time and told me straight up, "Boss, there's paper out on you. Green light from the top. Stand down, or we can't protect you." When I asked who put out the green light, he wouldn't say. But he didn't have to. I knew it hadn't come from any traditional gang leadership. The hit was sanctioned by the quiet ones, and that meant it would be carried out by professionals using resources I couldn't match. I had 48 hours to decide whether to keep digging or disappear into protective custody. Either way, my life as I'd known it was over. But I'd come too far to back down. I'd seen behind the curtain, and I couldn't pretend I hadn't. These people had been playing everyone. guards, inmates, administrators, even law enforcement, and for decades, they'd turned the prison system into their personal profit center while everyone else fought over scraps. Someone had to expose them, even if it killed me. That's when I learned what real power looks like in the California prison system and why Mike Harrington was never anything more than a convenient myth. The attempt on my life came during evening chow on a Tuesday, professional job. Two guys I'd never seen before, one blocking my path, to the serving line while the other moved in from behind with a shiv. If my cellmate hadn't spotted them coming and started a distraction at the other end of the hall, I'd be dead right now. But that attack told me everything I needed to know. These weren't gang members settling a score or drug dealers protecting territory. These were contractors, brought in specifically to eliminate a problem, and the only people with the resources to arrange something that's sophisticated were the quiet ones. I went into protective custody that night, but not before I managed to get one last piece of evidence that confirmed everything I'd suspected. During the chaos of the attempted hit, while the guards were focused on lockdown procedures, I broke into the administrative office and photographed the real-time communication logs. What I saw there changed my understanding of everything. The quiet ones weren't just running a criminal network. They were running multiple networks, each one insulated from the others, each one serving different functions in a criminal ecosystem that spanned decades and involved hundreds of people across multiple states. Network 1 was financial. The investment portfolios, the legitimate businesses, the money laundering operations. This was run by the guys I'd been tracking, the long-termers who'd turned their sentences into business opportunities. They'd been operating since the late 80s and had built a legitimate financial empire worth tens of millions of dollars. Network 2 was operational. Drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, contract violence, all the traditional criminal activities that everyone associated with prison gangs. But instead of being run by gang leaders fighting for territory, it was managed like a corporation. Routes were planned by logistics experts, conflicts were resolved through arbitration, profits were distributed according to predetermined percentages. Network 3 was political, the corruption network that kept everything running smoothly. Judges, prosecutors, parole board members, prison administrators, even some law enforcement officials, all connected through a web of financial incentives that made them stakeholders in the criminal enterprise rather than opponents of it. And Mike Harrington? He was the interface between all three networks. The traditional criminal world knew him as a gang leader, so they'd take orders from him. The corrupt officials knew him as a reliable business partner, so they'd provide services for him. The financial network knew him as a front man, so they'd fund his operations. But he wasn't running any of it. He was a middle manager, whose job was to make sure all three networks could operate without anyone realizing they were part of the same organization. The genius of it was that everyone got what they expected to see. Gang members saw gang politics. Law enforcement saw traditional organized crime. Financial regulators saw legitimate business investments. Nobody was looking for the connections between all three, because nobody believed those connections could exist. Except the connections were everywhere once you knew how to look for them. The construction company that had the contract for prison maintenance, owned by the financial network. The law firm that represented high-profile gang members, funded by the financial network. The non-profit organization that provided job training for parolees, a front for Network 2's recruitment operations. They'd built a criminal ecosystem that was completely integrated with legitimate society, and they'd done it so gradually, so professionally, that nobody had ever noticed. The communication logs showed me how decisions really got made. When there was a problem, a gang conflict threatening to disrupt operations, a law enforcement investigation getting too close, a business opportunity requiring criminal enforcement, it didn't get resolved through violence or intimidation. It got resolved through conference calls between network representatives who approached criminal problems like business problems. Mike Harrington wasn't on those calls. He got his instructions through intermediaries and carried them out without ever knowing why. The shot callers who thought they were his lieutenants were actually just middle management, implementing policies made by people they'd never met and couldn't identify. The whole California prison power structure was a corporate hierarchy disguised as gang politics, and everyone, inmates, guards, administrators, even law enforcement, was playing their assigned role without realizing there was a script. But here's the thing that really fucked with my head. It was working. Crime rates were down, prison violence was manageable, drug trafficking was predictable and contained. The network had brought order to chaos by turning criminal activity into a business enterprise. They'd solved the problems that law enforcement couldn't solve by making crime more efficient and less violent. From a purely practical standpoint, they were doing society a favor. That's when I understood why the attempt on my life had been authorized. I wasn't threatening a criminal enterprise. I was threatening a system that was actually working better than the chaos it had replaced. The quiet ones didn't want to kill me because I discovered their crimes. They wanted to kill me because I discovered their success. And that's why Mike Harrington had to remain a myth. As long as everyone believed in the traditional gang structure, as long as law enforcement focused on the flashy criminals and dramatic violence, the real network could continue operating in plain sight. Harrington wasn't their leader. He was their cover story. I've been in protective custody for 8 years now. The green light is still active, which means the network is still running. Harrington's been gone for 5 years, transferred to another facility under circumstances that were never fully explained, but the system he supposedly built never missed a beat. Because he never built it. He was just the face on a machine that was already running when he arrived and kept running after he left. The people who really run California's prison system are still out there, still operating, still making sure that crime remains organized, predictable, and profitable. They've turned the correction system into their corporate headquarters and convinced everyone, inmates and guards alike, that what they're seeing is gang politics instead of business management. And as long as nobody looks too closely at the quiet ones, the ones who never make trouble but somehow always have what they need, the system will keep running exactly as designed. This is what I learned when I tried to expose the truth about Mike Harrington. This is why they tried to kill me, and why they're probably still trying to kill me. The most dangerous truth in the California prison system isn't that there's corruption or criminal activity, it's that there's organization, and the people who built that organization are still in control, still pulling the strings, still making sure that the chaos everyone expects is actually carefully managed order. Mike Harrington was never the king. He was just the mask they put on the machine, and the machine is still running.